Today, I interview famous polyglot Steve Kaufmann, and he reveals the exact method he used to learn over 20 languages, how he successfully learns languages as an older adult, the two most important things when learning any language, the real reason you're nervous to speak in public, and more. Let's start the interview. Welcome back, Steve. It is so great to have you here.
I'm happy to be here.
I have an idea for you. So
Okay.
there's so much information online and common personal beliefs about how to learn a language.
Mhm.
Now, given your experience, I'd love to share a common belief with you and then see if you think it's true or false, and then you can explain why. How does
Okay.
that sound to you?
Sounds good.
Okay, and for all my students watching, participate as well. So after I share the statement, you can say if it's true or false in the comments and then see how your answer compares to Steve's. All right, Steve, true or false? Adults, especially older adults,
Right.
can't truly become fluent.
Okay. First of all, I think I qualify as an older adult. It's funny because what's old? Like for someone 15, 40 is old. Um, I think there are two issues there is does age affect your ability to learn? And the second thing is what do we mean by fluent?
Yes,
So,
I'm so glad. Actually, that was going to be my follow-up question. So if you want, before we go any further, let's
yeah,
just define fluency. So what does being fluent in a language mean to you?
to me, the best definition of fluent is that you feel comfortable and the person listening to you feels comfortable. So, obviously, if I'm having trouble getting my meaning across, I'm not comfortable and I'm not fluent. If I can get my meaning across, and it has to be on a wide range of subjects. It can't just be, I'll have another cup of coffee, please. You can't, it can't be on something very, very limited. Or what's the weather like? You have to be able to talk about a variety of subjects. What are your kids doing? What do you do at work? What do you think of, history, politics, you name it. You have to be able to talk about a variety of subjects with mistakes, but where you feel comfortable and the person listening feels comfortable. And you know that if you speak to someone who doesn't speak, say, English in my case, very well, I'm not comfortable if the person is struggling. If I speak their language, I'll switch to their language. So to me, the key thing is that you can express yourself on a variety of things. You're comfortable, even though I'm aware that I make mistakes. I'm comfortable getting my meaning across, and I have the feeling that the person listening is also comfortable. That's fluency. It doesn't mean perfect. It doesn't mean that I don't forget the odd word, that I don't occasionally have to say, I beg your pardon, could you repeat that, please? All of that is fine. It's still within the range of what I consider to be fluent.
Well,
Fluent doesn't mean perfect.
I'm glad you clarified that. Now, going back to the first question. So let's say adults, older adults. So this, like you said, could be anything, but let's say someone trying to learn a language in their 40s and after. They can't truly become fluent.
Okay, well, I would say that my real interest in learning a lot more languages started when I was 55. So,
Okay.
and most of my languages I have learned them as an adult, like past the age of 20. So theoretically, based on what I have, based on my reading, we may lose some ability to learn languages. We may have more trouble retrieving things from our memory. We may learn a little more slowly, but the difference is not great.
Mm.
There may be some difference, but it's not a big. A far more important issue is motivation and how much time you spend. So if you are motivated and you put in the time, and make no mistake, you got to put in the time. And you've got to put in the time in an intelligent way. In other words, put in the time with the language, not reading explanations in your own language about the language for the 10th time reading an explanation about tenses in English, which even I can't understand the explanations. If you spend your time doing that, you won't improve much. But if you spend your time, lots of time with the language, listening to things of interest, reading things of interest, If you enjoy the process, you have a positive attitude, I don't care whether you're 50, 60, 70, and I'm almost 80. And I don't think we don't slow down very much. We don't slow down very much.
Well, I'm so glad you said that because many of my students say directly to me or in the comments of videos, "Oh, I'm in my 30s or 40s, so I can't become fluent." And you just proved that is clearly false. And I love what you said about motivation as well.
I have learned, I would think 10, 11, 12 languages since the age of 50. Like, if not more, I'd have to go through the list, but the bulk of them since the age of 50. And some of
Wow.
those languages I speak quite well, some I speak less well. But again, as long as you enjoy what you're doing in the language, it's not a horse race. You're not competing with anyone. So whatever my language or level, excuse me, in the languages, I'm happy.
Now, you said some of them you speak better than others. Is there a reason why? Does it come back to your motivation to learn that language or the amount of time you just spend in that language?
So, I mean, there's comprehension, and then there's the ability to speak. So my approach to language learning is very much focused in on comprehension, like listening and reading, building up my vocabulary. So I have languages where I have very good comprehension, but I don't speak them that well because I
Mhm.
have a limited opportunity to use them. So the languages that I speak the best are the ones that I've used the most, speak the best. However,
Mhm.
to get to where you can speak a lot, you need a lot of comprehension and vocabulary. So you have to begin with getting that vocabulary and comprehension going. Uh, so yeah, the ones that I speak the best, the top four, I have spoken the most. But there are languages where I don't speak them that badly, and I haven't had much opportunity to speak them at all. Because
Hmm.
again, according to our statistics at Link, I have, vocabulary of 50,000 words in these languages. So it wouldn't take long if you have a good level of vocabulary and comprehension and you are given an opportunity. If you should move to Costa Rica, for example, and you have a large vocabulary in Spanish and good comprehension, and you have opportunity to speak there, you will very quickly improve.
That is an excellent point, and it leads into another true or false statement I'd like to get your opinion on. So, what about this one? You can't become fluent if you live in a country where the language isn't widely spoken.
So I always remember when I wrote a book about language learning, and the book was sold in China, and so I went to China to promote the book, and I was at a university in China, which was a sort of foreign language, YU in Beijing, where they study foreign languages, and I had these students, come up to me, speak to me in Japanese, in French, in English, and they were so fluent, and they had never left China. Okay. On the other hand, in Canada, as you know, we have immigrants who have lived in Canada for 30 years and can hardly speak English. And so it's very much a matter of, again, motivation and time. So
Hmm.
those students in China wanted to learn, spent the time, and went at it in a very focused way, and they were extremely fluent. And immigrants from China who have lived in Canada for 30 years still can't speak English because they're not motivated and they don't put in the time. So
How
I think it's help. How, having said that, of course, you need the opportunity to speak eventually, And so, obviously, if you live in the country where the language is spoken, you have more opportunity to speak. So it's a better environment for learning the language, but it's not a condition. You can improve tremendously even if you're not in the country where the language is spoken. And being in the country where the language is spoken is no guarantee that you're somehow automatically going to learn the language. You still have to put in the effort.
Yeah, exactly. And like you said, I'm sure we can all think of where we live, non native speakers in the country where we live, and know that they don't speak the language fluently, even though they live there. Now, what about this next statement that I hear commonly?
Okay.
You must speak directly with native speakers if you're in the country, or it could be Zoom, online, doesn't matter where, but you must speak directly with native speakers to improve your language or become fluent. What do you think? True or false?
Well, I don't like the word must. However, two things there. One is motivation is so important. So if I'm learning Persian or Greek or Chinese, I want to learn, I want to speak to a person from that language background. Because to me, Persian is about Iran, Chinese is about China. English is a different situation because people learn English. Well, it depends where they are. I mean, if they are in an English-speaking country, they're learning English to communicate better with the people in that country, Canada, US, England, Australia, wherever. However, English is an international language. So if you are Japanese and you're going to Brazil, you're going to speak English in Brazil, unless you know Portuguese. So English is the language you use to communicate with people from Brazil, from Korea, from India, from Iran, from wherever. So in that sense, for someone learning English, it doesn't matter as much, and you should get used to hearing people speaking with different accents, and in a way, if you're learning a language, so motivation is one reason why I would prefer to speak to a native speaker. But the key thing in language learning is vocabulary. So if you're speaking to a non-native speaker who has a broad vocabulary, and if that conversation is authentic, then I don't mind speaking to a non-native speaker. But if it's a sort of a artificial learning exercise, or we're a group of Japanese learners sitting in a classroom, we're all speaking with the same Japanese accent, I don't think that's so useful. So I guess the nuance is that personally, I'm more motivated to speak to a native speaker, but English is a special case because it's such an international language.
Yeah, what an interesting perspective. I'm sure you've really got my students thinking about how they perceive this, because a lot of times they say, "Oh, I don't want to practice speaking because it's not with a native speaker." But with English being so international, like you said, that's a really good point.
Right. But it's a matter of motivation. If a person really wants to speak to a native speaker, then that's what they should do. The big
Yeah.
thing in language learning is do what motivates you.
Yeah. Do what motivates you. What a simple thing. Do what motivates you. Very true. Now, I know you emphasize the importance of expanding your vocabulary, and reading is a key for you, I believe.
Mhm.
So perhaps you can explain why you think reading is a great strategy to improve your fluency, because this might be a little counterintuitive to some of my students, because they place so much emphasis on speaking, speaking, speaking. So when they hear reading, they might not follow that advice, or they might think it's incorrect. So I'd love to hear your perspective on that.
Okay, so the language, the foreign language that you're learning, you don't have it inside you, right? It has to come from outside. If you start from zero, you got no words in the language. So that's where I support Stephen Krashen's ideas about input. You have to bring the language into you, and you can only bring it into you in two ways: listening and reading. Or you can also review vocabulary, but there's a lot of research that shows that the way our brain works, if these words aren't connected with other words, they've done this, magnetic resonance imaging, and they see that it's more difficult. You
Mm.
have to encounter these words in different contexts. So you can encounter them in a listening context, you can encounter them in a reading context. I have always found that the two work together. That if I just listen, I can't remember the word. I mean, I was just in a conversation with my Persian tutor, and until she writes the word out for me in the chat box, I can't quite grasp what she's saying because it's a new word. It's I don't know what it is. Like there's this expression: you can only learn what you already know. So you kind of need to hit it twice: the reading and then the listening. So you listen to things that you have read, you read things that you have listened to, and the two of them reinforce each other. What I have found from personal experience is that the listening helps me prepare for speaking because I find these words and phrases bouncing around in my brain. But to retain the vocabulary, reading is more powerful than listening. And we should also realize that reading is like listening, that once the written word is decoded and goes into your brain. It then follows the same path in the brain as sounds, the phonetic, you know, receptors. But I'm not a neuroscientist, but it follows the same path. So I wouldn't say reading alone, but so what I tend to do is I listen when I'm doing other things like washing the dishes or driving my car or out for a walk. But if I have dedicated time, I read.
And how much dedicated time do you spend reading, let's say per day, in your target foreign language? So in this case, we'll say Persian.
So most people who are learning English already know the Latin alphabet. So it's easy for them to read. For me, the Arabic and Persian alphabet is, I mean, it's still difficult, even though I know how it works, but I haven't had, I haven't read billions of words in that language. Whereas if you're a Spanish speaker, now, if you're a Chinese speaker learning English, of course, you don't have the advantage, but you have a better knowledge of the Latin alphabet than I have of the Persian alphabet. But typically, what I do, I would say that I manage to get in about half an hour to an hour a day of listening because I'm always doing things around the house or I'm out for a walk or whatever it might be. And I try to get in half an hour to an hour a day of reading. But when I'm reading in the Persian alphabet, because it's so difficult for me, I only read online. So I only read on my iPad because then I can look up every word. I can sound it out. I can hear it. I can save it. I work on LingQ on my iPad, at least a half an hour, maybe an hour a day.
Okay. Well,
iPhone, it's the same. It's synced, so I can do it wherever I want. But yeah, I think if I'm reading, say, Polish, it's easier to grab a book that's not digital text and read because I can read. Turkish, I can at least make out the sounds in Turkish, whereas the Arabic and Persian script is still more of a mystery to me. Not a mystery, but I'm not used to it like that. So that's my situation. Now, someone else whose native language is written in the Latin alphabet would be in a certain situation. If their native sort of script is something else, they might be closer to my situation with Persian.
I love how your advice is so specific to your background, the target languages you're learning. I think that's great so everyone could realize how customizable learning a language is. And maybe there isn't just one way to do it. It depends on your background, the language you're learning, and many other situations. So I really love how you're bringing that to light. Now, input, get a lot of input. But what about this statement? What do you think? True or false? You need both input, like reading, and output, like speaking, to feel confident and comfortable with a language.
Well, if you want to feel confident and comfortable speaking, you need to speak a lot. In order to be confident and comfortable speaking, you need a high level of comprehension and a broad vocabulary, unless you want to talk about a very limited number of subjects. So you really can't separate the two. But eventually, if you want to speak well, you have to speak a lot. But to
And
get you can speak a lot, you do have to put the time into, and even after you think you're at a level, like typically when I start speaking online with a tutor, I again, based on how we count words at LingQ, I want at least 5,000 words. I'm not even going to talk to someone until I have 5,000 words. But even after that, if I'm talking twice, 3 times a week with a tutor, so I feel now I'm at a level where I can start speaking more and more, I still continue my input activities. So you can't separate the two. But ultimately, you have to speak a lot to speak well.
And aside from talking directly with your tutor, do you speak to yourself? Do you record yourself? Do you use ChatGPT or do you have other strategies for
None of the
speaking?
above. None of the above.
None of the above. So just with your tutor.
See, I also think so you were saying, everyone's situation is different, different age, different native language, different target language. There are certain things that are in common. One, motivation and time. Motivation and time. Those are the two most important elements. So I'm not motivated to speak to ChatGPT. I'm not motivated to speak to myself. I have tried these things, shadowing and keeping a diary, and I can't do. I can't continue doing them because I don't enjoy doing them. To me, the easiest thing is just to speak to a native speaker, which I prefer, which wouldn't be the case if I were a non-native speaker of English. I think it matters less in English because the reality is that English has become an international language, whether we like it or not for political reasons. That's the reality. For example, in Spanish, which is also an international language, regional, but an international language. But again, that's just among Spanish speakers. But there are Arabic or Russian, like say Russian. I don't mind speaking Russian to a Latvian. In other words, where these languages have become international languages, then it becomes authentic to speak to a speaker of those languages, an English speaker from Brazil. It becomes authentic. But doing things that are not authentic, like talking to ChatGPT or talking to myself, is not something that I do. But people who enjoy doing that, that's what they should do. I am not at all stressed by speaking to a native speaker, but there are people who find it stressful. And for those people, it might be more comfortable to speak to ChatGPT. So it depends on the individual.
Yeah, exactly. And like you said, just so simple. Motivation, time just comes down to those two things. I like how you can summarize that so succinctly. Now, we talked about reading, listening, speaking. What about this statement? True or false? You should study grammar and make sure you understand grammar rules before you start speaking.
Definitely no. Definitely no. So the whole process of learning is kind of sort of a fuzzy process. You cannot understand or make sense of or eventually use the grammar rules until you have had enough exposure to the language. So you have to do a lot of listening, then you start speaking. As you speak, you make mistakes. You realize, most people realize where they're struggling. They realize what they have trouble expressing in the language, where they have an insufficient grasp of proper usage. So now they're curious about proper usage. So then they are more likely to understand, accept the usage explanations they find in the grammar. So the whole thing is kind of intertwined.
Mhm.
And certainly I to me, I start speaking when I have a certain level of vocabulary, period. When I have enough words to say some things and understand what's coming at me. Grammar is something that's you go back at over and over and over again. You look at the rule, you never master the grammar. You look at the rule, makes an impression on you, you forget it, you continue making the same mistake, you go back to the grammar again. So you can always go back to the grammar rules, but it's this whole idea that somehow you're going to master the basics. Now you've got the grammar nailed down. Now you can speak without mistakes. That simply has not been my experience. My experience has been that grammar is sort of out there. It's 5-10% of where you spend your time. When you're curious, you look things up. When I want to look up a conjugation table, I go to Google, I look up the conjugation table. You can, I have read, just out of curiosity, I've read books explaining English grammar. I mean, the explanations about the use of tenses make no sense to me as an English speaker. I can't make sense of those explanations. How does a non-English speaker make any sense of those explanations? I have no idea. Until you've had so much experience with the language that those explanations relate to something that you have already experienced. And then it's more or less explaining things to you that you already know intuitively.
A very counter perspective than most language learners probably expect, at least the ones that I work with, where the focus is so much on grammar. So I really loved hearing your refreshing take on that and your personal experience with that. How about this one? True or false? Being nervous before speaking is a sign that you're not ready, your level's too low, or you're just not ready to start speaking.
I think being nervous is more a matter of your willingness to take risks, period. So there are people whose level of English or whatever language they're learning is terrible. They're not nervous and they're terrible. There are people who actually are quite good in the language who are going to be nervous. I don't think it's particularly important. Obviously, the less nervous you are, the better, because the fact of being nervous is going to inhibit you. You're going to have more trouble remembering, more trouble expressing yourself because you're kind of blocked. I think perhaps people who put too much emphasis on grammar are more nervous about this. Gets back to Stephen Krashen and his effective filter. They're more worried about whether they're speaking correctly, whereas they should really be just trying to find words. I looked up, there's this research on when we get to where we have utterances, we're trying to say things in the language. What is that process? And apparently that process consists of three things. First of all, certain words will pop out, words that we know that what it means and we're comfortable using, and we throw the word out there. We try to find a way to use that word in the discussion we're having. The next thing that happens is we will try out phrases, constructions in the language that have worked before, that we know work, and we throw those out there. And then the third thing we have to do is we have to suppress things that don't belong, which could be from our own language or for another language that we know. So that is the process. And we just have to expose ourselves to that, go ahead and do it, not worry about anything. Whatever comes out will come out. So I don't think that I don't think being nervous per se means that it's too early or you shouldn't be or anything. It's more but my advice is don't worry about it. Things are going to come, things will pop out, words will come out, constructions will come out, and you will always leave the conversation saying to yourself, geez, now I know that word. I couldn't think of it during the conversation because you were stressed, and everyone is a little bit stressed. You couldn't recollect, you couldn't retrieve that word. And once the conversation is over, no more stress, you can remember the word. All normal, all good. And as language learners, we have to be willing to accept a significant level of uncertainty. Otherwise, we'll never learn. I don't know if that's a good answer or not, but I think the level of nervousness is not an indication of anything other than your level of nervousness.
I think that was the perfect answer because it is, again, is just such a different perspective. The fact you're nervous is because you're not willing to take risk. And I'm sure everyone can agree or imagine themselves in that situation and say, yeah, you're right. I wasn't willing to risk being wrong or sounding incorrect or feeling uncomfortable in that moment. That was the issue.
Mm-hmm.
I really love that. Thank you for sharing that, Steve. Now, I was on your channel and I saw you had a video on 6 habits that make you a successful language learner. So,
Mm-hmm.
if you had to choose one habit from that video or any habit that my students can make a priority starting today, what habit would you choose for my students?
Now, I produce a video every week, so I can't remember. But I think the most important, again, so I don't know what I said there, but I believe it's extremely important to find a way to enjoy the process of learning. Everything that you can do to make the process enjoyable. In other words, finding content of interest, speaking to people you like, listening to content where you enjoy the voice. Like right now, the Persian podcast that I'm listening to, the person has a very nice voice and he's talking about subjects that are of great interest to me. Very hard to learn the language from content that's of no interest. Or very often beginner books have narrators that are very boring and whose voice is bored. And so, that's not enjoyable. So if you can find ways and do things you enjoy doing, whatever you enjoy doing, you enjoy speaking to native speakers, fine. You enjoy speaking to non-native speakers, that's fine. Do things that you enjoy doing. Why? Because we get back to the 2 essential elements, attitude and time. So if you're doing things that you enjoy doing, you're likely to be motivated and you're likely to put in the time.
Well, there you go. Now you know what to do, everyone. Find the way that you enjoy improving your English and learning English and make that your priority this week. Now, Steve, can you please tell everyone about LingQ a little bit more and tell them how they can learn more and connect with you as well?
Okay, well, connecting with me, I have a YouTube channel called Lingo Steve, and I put a video out every week, so people are welcome to go there and check my videos in the past that I've done and where I speak in different languages and so forth. LingQ is a language learning platform that I started with my son Mark about 20 years ago, and we basically try to do several things there. First of all, we sort of implement the sort of input-based language approach of that Stephen Krashen explains. That's not that we discourage people from speaking. In fact, we have tutors there, and once I get to a certain level, I like to engage with tutors, as I've said. But it's input-based learning is something that we can do wherever we want, anytime, any place. We don't need a tutor to be doing those things. And so we build ourselves up to where we can start engaging with tutors and eventually talking to people. So one, we sort of implement in an efficient way input-based learning with a lot of functionality and a lot of statistics that nudge you along, your goals, a record of what you've achieved. And the second thing is we take advantage of the internet. We take advantage of digital text where you look things up, and we keep track of the words you know. We can access YouTube, Netflix, any digital content on the web can be imported into LingQ. So we take advantage of the sort of revolution that is the internet and the amazing explosion of language content that's available on the internet. And yet we introduce functionality that helps you learn, from this input. But there are lots of sites where you can speak. I mean, we don't have any monopoly on sort of tutoring sites, but we feel that it's quite an efficient way to sort of optimize that whole input-based learning activity. LingQ is LingQ.com, and of course we welcome people. And we have 50 languages, and I think we're going to launch Punjabi this month. And there's a rumor that we're launching Irish Gaelic around St. Patrick's Day.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, I will leave all the description. I'll leave everything in the description. So please, to all my students, follow Steve. His YouTube channel is amazing. And also, LingQ is an awesome resource. So go check it out in the description. Thank you, Steve, so much for being here. It's been such a pleasure having this conversation.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
If you enjoyed this interview, please say thanks, Steve. Thanks, Steve. Please say thanks, Steve, in the comments. And of course, like this interview, share it with your friends, and subscribe so you're notified every time I post a new lesson. And you can watch the first interview I did with Steve Kaufmann, where he shares more practical tips and advice. Watch it right now.